Well, thank you all for joining me again. This time, I'm not in Chicago. I'm joining you from Memphis tonight, where I am visiting for work. And I have beautiful, new, interesting scenery tonight, right near Beale Street. So I come to you from a festive environment. Uh, Thanks for tuning in for the second episode of this behavior problems or problem with behavior problem session. Tonight is a little bit different in that we are going to dive into the issues that people have with their bodies, and this is really, to me, is a is an area of support that we don't talk about enough. We often think about behavior in terms of uh, how to get kids to stop or start doing something. And if we are trying to get kids to stop or start doing something, that conversation is often about motivation. It's often connected to this notion of agency, that kids, have control and power. If we can steer them or guide them or find the thing that will interest them, we can shape and mold their responses. But in this session, we're going to talk about why that may not always be true, and how so many kids with not just autism, but kids with Down syndrome and kids with even certain kinds of learning disabilities and students with OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, that all kinds of kids struggle with some of these issues. And what's interesting to me about working in so many inclusive schools is that I find that we bring in supports for kids with certain disabilities, and all of a sudden I see kids with other needs, or kids that don't appear to have really many kinds of needs related to the body. They're seeking out those supports. So it tells us that this is a bigger issue than we might, than we might view at first glance. So I'm going to talk about two different parts of these body problems. I'm going to talk a little bit about sensory needs, and I'm going to talk about something that I'm calling movement disturbance or movement differences. And this is largely based on the work of Anne Donnellan and Martha Leary, and a few other folks that I'll be talking about a little bit later. But I think you'll find this, I find this topic super fascinating. And I'll be very honest in telling you that this approach to behavior support really changed my work. And I don't think it's going too far to say it really changed everything about the way that I went about my business in the classroom and how I thought about people with disabilities. So I don't want to oversell it, but I hope that you find this illuminating as well. So the very first thing I want to have a conversation about are these sensory issues. And the sensory issues are things that I think teachers know a little bit more about and families know a little bit more about. We hear accounts from people with disabilities talking about these sensory kinds of needs. And as I said, even though I'm using the words here of people on the autism spectrum, I think that you probably know, if you've been in the business for a while or if you parent, that many kids with learning differences have, maybe not to this degree, but they do have some of these same differences. So here's Leanne Holiday, and if you know Leanne Holiday Willie, she is a woman who is on the autism spectrum herself, and she's written books, and she has written actually a really great, one of my favorite books on the topic of autism, which is called Pretending to be Normal. And she's written a book called Asperger's Syndrome in the Family, because she has a daughter who's on the spectrum. And here is a quote from one of her books. Leanne says, "Bright lights, midday sun, reflected lights, strobe lights, flickering lights, fluorescence, each seemed to sear my eyes. My head would feel tight, my stomach would churn, my pulse would run my heart ragged until I found a safety zone." And then here's Tyler talking about auditory sensitivity. "I can hear things that people can't hear. I can be in a room of the house and hear what my mother's saying on the phone, even when she has the door shut. And there are certain sounds that are painful to listen to, like the microwave, the telephone ringing, lawnmowers, leaf blowers, the blender, babies crying, vacuum cleaners." People report some of these, as you can see here, to be not just annoying as you might find them, but painful. How would a student react if there was if they were experiencing sensory sensitivity in the classroom. And if you can imagine, if you were in pain, how you might respond, and you might not look appropriate. And here's the challenge about this as it relates to behavior. A lot of us may assume that we will know when a student is having sensory sensitivity. So a myth persists that, if this child is really has auditory sensitivity, she'll clamp her hands on her ears and then I'll know. Not necessarily true. Or I had a teacher tell me I'm really alert to sounds in our environment. And if, as soon as I identify one, I try to provide my students comfort. The problem with that is you may not hear what the student hears. So the student may be hearing a fire truck that's a couple of miles away. You can't perceive it. You don't hear it, but he does. And so it's really hard for you to provide comfort or understand the antecedent to a behavior that you cannot perceive. So many of our kids have such incredible hearing, and they perceive things in ways that are sometimes baffling. For example, I was reading this wonderful book about a love, Asperger, I guess you would say, love story. And it was kind of telling the story as a couple, it's Jerry Newport and Mary. And it's a book called Mozart and the Whale. And maybe you've seen the feature film also of the same title. But Mary talks about her sensitivity. And she said, a lot of kids on the autism spectrum, they get their hearing checked when they're little a lot, because one of the first things that a parent may assume about a child who is yet to be diagnosed is that he has low hearing or he's deaf, because they don't respond to certain things in the way that you would assume they would. And that's that hypo or hypersensitivity. You can have a child who has this sound that, is really, for everybody else in the household, really annoying and really grating, and the child doesn't respond at all. And then you have a sound that to you seems innocuous. Maybe somebody's just, yesterday was Halloween or 2 days ago, and someone's rustling a candy wrapper. And for some people that's nothing. And for other people that's nails on the chalkboard. Anyway, Mary was saying that her mother was shocked because she said she didn't respond to certain sounds in the ways that were expected. So she took Mary to the doctor, and the doctor was going to do a hearing test. And Mary's doctor took Mary's mother into the hallway and whispered into her ear, "May I give her a sucker, a candy, when the test is over?" And Mary, sitting on the table, the examining table, inside the room, with the door all but shut tight, responded quite, I guess, almost with a shout out the door, "Yes, I would love a candy when the test is done." So the doctor basically said, "Okay, the hearing test is over. We really don't need to conduct that anymore." So that's what we're talking about. It's so uneven that it would be really hard for us to guess that somebody's in distress. And it's really important to know that kids may not show you distress. They may not be able to say, I'm in sensory distress. And so it could be from not just hearing things and not just light, but it could be also things like temperature. I know a lot of kids, and I'm sure you do too, who have real struggles with the seasonal changes. And so the temperature, they seem to be having a day that's pretty good, and it looks just like other days. But what you don't understand is today in the classroom, it's 1 degree colder or warmer than it usually is. And that, the child was doing all they could to hold it together. And that, couple of degrees, 1 or 2 degrees in the temperature, that's the straw that breaks the camel's back. So I can't say too much about sensory needs here because I'm not an occupational therapist. And so the one thing I will say is as it connects to behavior is just make sure that you're working very closely with your occupational therapists on sensory evaluations, observing students very carefully to see if any of the behaviors that they're engaged in may have some kind of root in the sensory system. I'll just tell you one more story that relates to this, because I think, again, when we don't perceive it, kids can really fool us. I was approached by a parent, and she said, "I know you hate when people ask you behavior questions." Well, that's not exactly true. What I don't like and what I don't feel comfortable with is people asking me questions like, "What do you do for a kid who's always off task?" And the reason I don't want to answer that, I think you already know if you tuned in last time, is because I just feel like out of context, you can't solve anything. I don't know about what the child needs, and I don't know how interesting the curriculum is, and I don't understand what his body problems are, and so on. So her issue was, she said, well, I'm going to ask you one of those questions anyway. What do you do about a kid that's always trying to get out of a moving vehicle? I'm like, oh my gosh, that sounds terrible. As a parent, she's terrified. And of course, I said to her the thing she didn't want to hear is, I cannot answer that question. And don't ever try to answer those questions, because we don't know what is connected to that question. We don't know what the needs are. We don't know if somebody's going through, a certain crisis in their life. So by itself, it's very hard to answer. But she was a parent. She was desperate. And I thought the least I can do, being this was a friend, I can brainstorm with you. So I started by asking her a ton of questions, and the answers to those questions were just no good. So I was asking her things like, okay, is it a new route, and all those kinds of things. She said, well, he's been going to middle school for a while, but he didn't act like this in the beginning of the year, but maybe he's getting used to it now. She had some theories. She thought, well, maybe he's growing and changing, and maybe this is some kind of a physical struggle that he's having. But that didn't really explain why she wasn't seeing it at other times. And she said sometimes it almost looked violent, like he would try to grab for the door, and he's almost succeeded in opening the door at least once. And so we went through all these different issues. What could be happening with him? So I suggested, did she change her route in any way that was upsetting to him? No, that she could perceive. This was always the same route. So we went through all these questions, and we couldn't come up with anything. And she told me, I said, do you have a new vehicle? Thinking maybe something with the vehicle. And she said, no, my vehicle's so old, And then, later, this was like weeks later, I ended up, I didn't ride with her, but I came out to her vehicle for something. And I noticed that she had one of those, little pine tree scent, things hanging off of her mirror. And I said, how old is that? And as soon as I said it, she kind of like this light bulb went on, and she said, a couple of weeks old. And she took it out of the car, and she vacuumed out the vehicle, and she aired out the vehicle, and she didn't see the behavior anymore. And she became convinced that what was happening was that she had put this, and she said he has never shown any kind of sensitivity towards any other smell that she could think of. No, I said, any cooking sensitive? No, nothing like that. In the art room? No. So she wasn't turned on to the idea that had been an issue for him. So it certainly wasn't something that she thought of as far as not wearing perfume and those kinds of things. So this was a new area that emerged for him. And it certainly affected his behavior. So had we tried to solve that behavior outside of context, we might have given him some kind of reward for, we might have given him some kind of a reward for doing something like, well done. Just be very careful about assumptions that you make about kids, because just because they haven't shown sensitivities doesn't mean that they don't have them, or that sensitivities won't change. So in some kind of work with the OTs very closely on this. What have their experience that just because a parent says we haven't seen it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. In that previous example, that child had not shown those kinds of sensitivities. So once you get that information, all you know at that point is that the parent has not seen it, and it doesn't mean that you don't want to be on the lookout for that. So just be really aware that these sensitivities look really different across kids. One of the things I like to do, if I had you right in front of me at this part of the workshop or seminar, is I like to play a game with folks. And this is actually a game. I'll give a little plug for my favorite book that relates to this inside out look at autism. It's called Walk a While in My Autism. Walk a While in My Autism. And it's different simulations and games and exercises that you can use with groups, especially those of you that are trainers and that you work with, or you want to teach your teachers and teach kids. Some of them are real appropriate for kids. And Walk a While in My Autism is written by Nan Negri. and Kate McGinnity. And I like this book because it has all kinds of neat simulations that help us communicate experiences and help us to clarify our values around this work. But one of their exercises is kind of one of those sensory overload exercises, you know, where you have the group take notes and then you throw things at them, and you make the group uncomfortable. You might play music, you know, and in patterns that are sort of annoying, and you get the idea. So I often use one of those exercises with teachers, and it's interesting, while they're working on their notes, I'll often, you know, try to, you know, find, you know, 5 different ways to get them off track. I might bring some scarves around the classroom and just wave the scarf in their face, and it's really annoying. And at the end, many people will say what you expect. They say, that was annoying, that was awful, I hated it, oh, the music, oh, I hated it when the lights were going on and off. And so we talk about how people felt about it. And then at the end of the exercise, I ask, okay, was there anybody who wasn't bothered? And there's always some people that say, well, that stuff doesn't really bother me. But the next question I ask is this: how much work did you get done? And invariably they'll say, oh, I didn't get any work done. It didn't bother me, but I didn't get any work done. Or they show me the quality of their work and it's terrible. So that to me is a good indicator of what sensory disruption can look like. Sometimes it's not so much that you have a bad behavior or that you, you know, you shut down, but it may be just that your production comes down, that your work doesn't look great. And so the teacher may say, come on, I gave you the whole hour to work and this is all you did. But today maybe there's heavy equipment in the parking lot, and so I just cannot focus. Okay, so keep that one in mind too. So I want to talk to you about things that we're not going to talk about sensory evaluation and the things that OTs would do. Again, I don't have that background, but I want to give you some tools that you can use once you've done that work with your therapist, things that you can bring into the classroom. So we've done 2 things. We've brought in these sensory boxes and something called Fidget Bags. And the sensory box is kind of like the, if you actually are an elementary school teacher and you have space for that. And if you don't, you can go to this more portable option. So what's a sensory box? Well, sensory box, you can kind of see a picture of it there. And we have a weighted lizard, and we have rubber bands for the chairs, and we have little fidgets and things like that. And this is I believe at the time, this was like a 4th or 5th grade classroom that we had this in. And I'll give you the example of a student with a learning disability, a kid named Courtney. So the rule in this classroom was anybody can use basically anything from the box as long as you are using the materials appropriately. And this is where your occupational therapist comes in again. We had the therapist come in a couple times during the year, and the therapist would teach the kids about the items. Here's a time when you might need a desktop fidget. Here's a time when you might want to use like the weighted snake. Here's a time when I would suggest getting a little bit of movement. And so she would talk to them about their bodies. Well, there was a young kid, Courtney again, he might have had some mild learning differences, but no identified need really. And he came up to my colleague and he said, I really want the headphones today. Now the headphones were kind of pricey. And so my colleague said to him, oh, Courtney, we really have to reserve those for these kids, you know, with his classmates with autism. And he said, oh, miss, but I really need them today because I can't concentrate. And finally, my colleague got sick of, hearing it. And she said, okay, Courtney, fine, go ahead, take the headphones. And Courtney worked so quietly and so beautifully for the next, 40 to 50 minutes that my colleague said, order another pair of headphones. That was incredible. And that's what I mean by this being really appropriate for all kids. Some kids just want headphones because they've had a bad morning. Some kids have auditory issues that, again, don't manifest in the way of a negative, behavior, but they just don't feel balanced. And so in other kids, you're doing a lot to prevent behavior or to soothe somebody after any kind of incident has occurred. So you really want to teach about the materials. You want to teach about these materials even for kids with really that have communication issues. Even if you're not 100% sure that the student understands everything that you say, you want to give the benefit of the doubt and presume competence and complexity in kids. So teach about them, and don't just teach about them once. Come back during test time. Come back when you see a kid who looks like he's in distress every afternoon and reteach what he might need. Again, keep reviewing. So the sensory box, again, go to your OTs. You can even go to campaigns like those not the fund me, the teacher pages where you ask for your donations and talk about that you would like, or go to your PTO and say, these are some of the things that I would like to have for my classroom, so that it's universally supportive of all kids. The other idea is this little fidget bag, and that's something that's portable. And I brought you a little video. This is something that you can actually find on YouTube. And the reason I wanted to show you the video was, A, you might be sick of me already, and B, I thought you could kind of like have a moment where we could just kind of visit face to face here. But this is a video I made a couple of years ago, and I made it to every now and then I put a video out where I'll just kind of show people how to make something or a little hack or something like that. And I made this a couple of years ago because I wanted to give teachers the idea that they could use, again, a fidget bag for more than just 1 or 2 kids. So I'm showing it to you because, A, just to kind of break up the 2 hours, but also because this video is available on my YouTube channel, Paula Kluth YouTube channel. So if you want to take this video and go and show it to somebody and, inspire your teachers to go and create these for all kids, or show this to your PTO, you can do so. So let's take a look. Today's tip is using fidgets in the classroom in a way that profits not just kids with disabilities, but potentially other kids too. Many teachers offer a fidget toy to a kid in a classroom when there's a lot of sitting down time, or it's a time of high anxiety like test time. And these are all good uses for these materials. One way that you can actually make sure that the support is not only adopted by the student himself, but potentially becomes a support that he or she can use to learn about sensory needs, is by letting the student assemble his own fidget bag. And maybe starting with stocking that bag yourself with whether it's Play-Doh or koosh ball or weighted ball, maybe pencil toppers, those kinds of things. And then asking the student to sort of evaluate how the supports work for him or her. This kind of bag works very nice because you can fasten it or attach it inside a binder. And for a kid that's in upper elementary, middle school, or high school, then it's portable and they can take it with them class to class or even home if needed. Another neat support that I like to use with fidget bags is to actually create one for students without disabilities, potentially creating one for every student in the classroom. So if I'm going to make one of these for a student with a disability, I might make a whole set for the class if I have those materials, if I can get those materials. So you might, again, put out a set of materials in your classroom and let different students, different learners choose from a range of materials, which kinds of kids would need, like to fidget with something that's very tactily interesting, or some kids that just like something that lets them sort of exercise their hand or something like that. Or you can give kids all the same materials and let them trade and discuss. One of the nice ways I'd like to involve my occupational therapists in this task is to have them come on into our classrooms and talk to kids with and without disabilities about which tools would work best on a test day to calm you down, which tools might work best to help you stay on task. And so you can do a little bit of collaboration with folks in your school on something very simple and quite low cost, like a fidget bag. Okay, sorry about that. I'm still trying to master the software. I was trying to multitask. And so if you want to see that from beginning to end without the annoying interruptions that I provided for you, again, you'll find that on YouTube, and just put my name in. And I have a couple of videos, including that one. The other thing I would have you think about, especially for those of you that have connections to therapists or are therapists and feel passionately about supporting the body needs of our kids, is that idea of using instructional video for staff, I think, is a really smart one. Think about having a little video that helps all of your paraprofessionals, or helps all, the entire staff, like all of the related services staff, and helps all of the teachers that interact with a child learn about some of these sensory needs in a really quick and easy format of a 3-minute video where you can talk about 3 steps that will help them work with a student who has some of these needs. And so I said, now that we carry a video camera around in our pocket, it's really nice to create instructional videos for students, which we're going to talk about next week, but it's really nice to do it for staff too. So that's just an example of what that looks like. And if you'd like to use that, please feel free to do so. Just a few other ideas here. This is a little, just examples, just brainstorming examples. One of the things I like to do is create all kinds of dollar store differentiation ideas. And this is a little fidget that you can create with the little puffy paints, and you can have students create book covers, and then kids that like to, if they actually pick at some of this and take it off, that's okay. They can make their own, and it's a little tactile, so a lot of kids just like to run their fingers down that cover, and it's, for an older kid, it doesn't look as strange as having something else on the desktop, and they can pick materials that they find satisfying. So just, again, very inexpensive and something that all kids might want to have available to them. The other piece that I wanted to show you is what it might look like to create, I want to just jump ahead here, I'm going to go back and forth, but the other kind of DIY, do-it-yourself support that I added in here was what we call just a little office. And you can make one of these for every kid, or rather have kids make them for themselves. And this is just a way to kind of block out all the noise, if you will, the visual noise. A lot of teachers use these just for testing time, but you could make these available to any kid that just needs a little bit of privacy, and they just want to have a little bit of those, that border around them to feel a little bit calm and a little bit less distracted. And so we let kids even put a little picture inside the office, and they can put pieces on the outside of it that are meaningful to them, or reminders like this, concentrate and think. You can even put a little visual reminder of, how to breathe or be calm in the inside. But these are nice, and they're just, basically it's just a science fair board, 3-fold board, and very inexpensive. You can buy them in bulk, even if you want to make have one for the whole class. So that's an inexpensive study carrel that will also help to support your kids. A few other things. Let's go and look at some of these potential changes in some of the classroom, some of the potential changes you can make to the classroom itself. Changes in lighting, for example. So I gave you a little bit of information about what can be hard on kids. Changes in lighting might be looking around for sources of natural light. So many instances I'll say, maybe if there's certain times of the day when you don't need overhead lights, that might be profitable for some kids, especially if they're writing or reading. Of course, you would need make sure that the light is appropriate. But when kids are just listening, or when kids are, if they have the glow of a screen, you might be able to rely more on natural light. Beware in, warmer climates though, beware of glare and heat next to windows. So we put kids next to windows so that they can take advantage of natural light, but then some kids struggle because it's too hot. Lamp lighting can be helpful. So you have to talk to your building engineers, your custodians about what's available in your school. But for a lot of kids, lamp lighting is more soothing than the glare of the overheads. Fluorescents are really hard on a lot of learners. Again, learners with learning disabilities too, not just students with some of these sensory needs. So look at, what's been used in your district and what other teachers are finding helpful. Upward projecting versus downward projecting lighting. And so lamp lighting can be used for that. For some kids, if you cannot change the lighting, and that's actually true in some places, the use of inexpensive visors. If you go to Michael's or Hobby Lobby, those places, they have foam, even the dollar store may have foam visors. So for very young children, you could let kids make their own foam visors, baseball caps for older kids, things like that. The IEP can override high school rules that you can't wear baseball caps. So talk to folks about that. And then for some kids, what they're actually, when you see, behavior or struggle, what you're actually seeing is that they're reacting to the sound of fluorescent lighting. So you might be able to ask some kids in your class, does anybody hear the fluorescents? I can't hear them, but a lot of my friends can. And so ask them, maybe seat that child further away from the hum and the buzz of fluorescent lighting. The other thing to keep in mind is if you again have a great collaboration with your building engineers, a lot of times newer lights don't have such they don't have the rattle and the hum of older lights. So it may be a signal that your lights need a change. And so you might actually just try to replace them if you're having a lot of feedback from kids to that end. How about looking at your seating? If you are in a daily struggle with kids, especially for on-task behavior and getting down to work, and kids that don't look like, they're always needing breaks, that, to leave the classroom and things like that, how comfortable are there? I write a lot about, how classroom environments need to sort of rise up and change to meet the needs of learners, of diverse learners. And, part of that means you want to look at your school and as a whole and just say, how many ways are there to sit down here? The example I give is Google. If you've ever read about Google or seen pictures of what Google looks like, there's ball pits that people, I don't know if they really meet in the ball pits, but they have pods and little living room areas and all kinds of seating. And you have to realize that Google doesn't create all those unique seating areas just to be viewed as a fun place to work, but of course they do it because of productivity, right? They want people to get good work done. And so if we want kids to be productive, we have to offer comfortable spaces. Now, it doesn't mean if you have all kinds of ways to sit down in a classroom that you won't have to offer movement or novelty and instruction, but it does mean that you may see kids that look a little bit more organized, and again, it could be a preventative support for behavior. So the top 5 pictures are all 1 4th grade classroom. It doesn't mean you have to have all of these different kinds of options, but I think every teacher should have a handful of options. It might be that you see the physio ball in the bottom right corner, that's a high school, that you have a couple of inexpensive seat cushions from Kmart that if your older kids want to sit on the floor, that they can access. I was in an English class where she had a little love seat that kids could, if they were doing reading or independent writing, a couple of kids could access. So it may not be as extensive in older grades as it is in younger grades, but just, brainstorm with colleagues to say, are there ways that we could make kids more comfortable here so that they don't have so much struggle that they end up having to leave the learning environment? And I see that happen actually more often than I certainly would like to. Here's a study from Eileen Schwartz, Schilling and Schwartz actually, about the use of adaptive seating, in particular looking at therapy balls. And what they found was that students did much better when they had an alternative seating. They were more engaged, and they had better in-seat behavior, or what you might call on-seat behavior in this case, so that students, it was easier for them to kind of get down to work, and it seemed that that students sort of were presented as, as sort of being better behaved, and therefore teachers felt more positive about students' ability, in this case, potentially maybe to be included or to be positively supported in certain environments. So there's some research here that we can reference when we have naysayers. But the other thing that you can do when you're facing staff members who don't feel turned on to this is I like to bring alternative seating to faculty meetings and bringing fidgets to faculty meetings. And it's easy, it's interesting to see who wants to play with what or who wants to try out different kinds of seating. And sometimes once they actually try it out, I find that many of them are, more willing to get on board. So here is something called the Comfortable Classroom Checklist. It's from my book, You're Gonna Love This Kid. And I thought I had uploaded it, but I didn't. So we're gonna get that uploaded to you in the next day or two. You'll have this available to you. And it's just simply, again, like I said, it's not going to give you all of the answers. I would do this in collaboration with an occupational therapist, but it's just something that you and your OT can use to transition a child from one space to the next. So let's just say you're going from 7th to 8th grade, or you're going from elementary to middle school or preschool to kindergarten. The two of you can sit down and look over the checklist and provide guidance for the next year's support team. And this checklist is a place to actually organize your thoughts around how sensory issues may impact somebody's behavior, so that folks may, tune in as they're getting to know the student, to the fact that this child may suffer in ways that you don't see, and that behaviors may actually be a result of sensory discomfort. I'll keep that one in mind. All right, so I want to spend the rest of our time on this thing called movement disturbance or movement differences. As I said, it's one of the things that really got me thinking differently about the needs of individuals with not just on the autism spectrum, but many, many different folks. So I want to start by showing you a film clip. This is a movie that let's see, this is probably, 5 years old now. It's a movie I guess you would say I'm a co-director, and I don't know, the designer of the concept here of this Q&A style documentary. It's called We Thought You'd Never Ask, and there are some clips on YouTube. And I wanted to interview colleagues of mine on the autism spectrum, because I wanted to know if the way I was perceiving their body issues, if I was getting close, if I was in the ballpark. And I spent so much time talking to audiences about paying attention to body needs, and I realized, instead of me talking about it, maybe I should hand the microphone over to these colleagues of mine who are true experts in their lived experience. So the film, what I did was I designed all these questions, and you're only going to see a little part, but I asked, what is autism, and what's good about autism, and what's hard about autism, and those kinds of things. And so I want to show you a clip, and not all of it's about the body in the way that you might think. In other words, not everybody's going to be talking about sensory issues or actual movement, but what you're going to hear is different people talking about differences in perception and in memory and movement itself. And so it's only a handful of minutes, but I want to use that to launch a larger discussion about what we see in people, how some of these differences that we see in people's bodies and their different kinds of needs, and kind of get that inside out approach. And so I'm going to show you again just a short clip. I'm going to just take a minute to kind of cue this up for us. And so you're going to hear a couple of different people talking. Again, even though I said it's not the whole thing, the part I'm showing you is people talking very specifically about movement in the body. At least the first one.
I think society's too damn fast. I don't know how anyone can function with all the noise and the confusion and the chaos. I mean, I do not understand why people want to go at the speed of light,
In my situation, I've been overly sensitive to pain and overly sensitive to sound. Loud noise was just as bad as getting hurt. Until I learned about autism from an article written by Temple Grandin a few years before my diagnosis. I never heard of anybody admitting they couldn't tolerate loud noises. And I felt ashamed. I simply could not hold a thought about anything but cathedrals. I was forbidden to talk about them. I went along for the ride when they took somebody someplace. They'd go down a certain street and we'd go by a church that I liked, and I guess some child care workers would drive down, a street I wanted to go down because they didn't see any problem with it. and other ones were more strict than that. I think I was about 14 years old, and we had gone down past Gracie. And two girls, they were sitting next to me, they fought each other to get their hands in front of my face so I couldn't see the cathedral. Because they knew if they did that, they'd say, oh, they're trying to help Barbara, they must be doing okay.
We don't realize how complex movement is. How complex of a movement just picking up a pen is, and what parts of the body it goes through and what parts of the brain. And a lot of us on the spectrum do have motor planning problems.
When I was in college, somebody really taught.
All right, so I'm going to stop it there. Because we kind of start and end with specifically these ideas around movement. I want to just highlight some of the things that you heard there. Starting with, I don't know why people want to go at the speed of sound. It's hard to kind of keep up. So that, in very loose kind of terms, is a result of somebody who experiences the body differently, and that it's hard to kind of keep up perceptually with, when it's a frenzied approach to, sorry, can you hear me now? I moved the microphone during that. Can you hear me? Okay. So the idea that, Kathy, who is the very first, character that we see, the first woman that we see, Kathy's talking about just being overwhelmed and, really struggling with simple things like just the pace of things in the world. And that is a very common thing that folks talk about, and really a struggle for a lot of people. We hear the idea, Barbara says loud noise was as bad as getting hurt, something that was echoed in the sensory material that I shared. The idea that Barbara also says, I could not hold a thought in my head except for cathedrals. So this idea of being really impacted by certain kinds of thoughts, all of these things are part of what we would call this theory of movement differences. And then, of course, at the very end, when Kathy again talks about even picking up a pencil it can be, involve a series of steps. So all of those things are things that we hear very commonly for individuals with certain kinds of profiles. And this work of Anne Donnellan and Martha Leary and a guy named David Hill and many others have written about this in other ways using similar language. They talk about this theory of movement differences. And so this is not another label that you would give to people, but it's a way that that we can use, it's a lens we can use to understand what people are experiencing and to understand why people behave in certain ways. It's a way of understanding really oftentimes very unusual behavior. They talk about in their description of movement differences or movement disorders, they talk about seeing these similar kinds of behaviors across all kinds of populations, including in people with, again, as I said, OCD, people with Parkinson's, people on the autism spectrum, people with Down syndrome may experience some of these. And so I want to share a little bit more about this with you. If you can see this model, these on the left are some of the difficulties that folks may have. Folks who experience movement differences. They may have problems with starting. And so I want to tell you what that might look like if you were experiencing, or maybe you've seen it with kids, where you just can't initiate for whatever reason. So we have kids who just tell them to get started on their work and they just kind of sit there. or you call a child over to the rug and they stare at you. So some kids, the initiation of movement can be really overwhelming. We also see it in people with cerebral palsy. Stopping behaviors can be challenging. So once you're in some kind of a posture, people who get in repetitive behaviors, they keep talking about dinosaurs, they move back and forth, they're flapping their arms. For some people, those kinds of behaviors and postures and those kinds of ways of moving that sometimes are actually accommodations for challenging situations, and sometimes they're just interfering motions that the individual may not be even aware that they're participating in. They might not be even aware that they're exhibiting some of these kinds of behaviors. Problems with executing is being able to engage in behaviors in a way that looks typical. I think about people that I know that when they when they when they transition classes, they're very slow or they're way too fast, and so they talk too loud or you can't hear them at all. Those are execution problems. And then some of these others would be things like, continuing. You are in some kind of a posture, or you are engaged in a certain behavior, you're having a conversation, and you just kind of take a left turn. So somebody who is engaged in a turn taking back and forth in a conversation, and they veer off, and now they're on a new topic, or they're people with Parkinson's, for example, they're walking down the street, and all of a sudden they literally stop in their tracks and sort of vibrate. They can't take the next step. So the theory of movement differences suggests that folks across disabilities may be experiencing some of the same kinds of things. Combining means I can't look you in the eyes and have a conversation. Combining means sometimes I can't literally walk and chew gum at the same time. Some of you have experienced this. If you've ever tried to, look for somebody's address while you're listening to the radio, and so you try to turn on the radio while you're trying to look. Well, it's not like the wrong address is going to come on the radio, but you can't be listening to that while you're trying to pay attention. So you can't combine the two things. For a lot of people with disabilities, combining is really challenging. And so we have to be very sensitive to the fact that when people experience these problems, they might enter a situation of overload, and that's where you see a lot of peak in behaviors. Switching can be hard too, and that's where we see transition problems, going from space to space or activity to activity. When people have difficulties in those areas, you may see problems with all kinds of things. Speech may change. Folks may have emotional struggles. They may have have really unusual looking postures and things that are unusual, either like they may look intentionally bizarre, some things that folks do, or they may just look like the person's very uncomfortable. So I want to talk through some of those as I go through the examples, and then further provide you with some of the remedies, if you will. So here are some examples of people experiencing movement differences. This is Sandra, who says that she can be crying on the inside, but her eyes are dry. So this is somebody that has all kinds of problems with all kinds of states of emotion. She's not very expressive. She doesn't often smile. These are not problems with the emotions themselves. She reports that she feels these emotions, but it's really hard for her to really, again, these are problems with movement itself, that she can't easily reflect her emotions externally. And so she can be crying on the inside, but her eyes may be dry. It's hard to, here's Tito, who's written a couple of books. He talks about sometimes he can't find stability. Sometimes he feels like his body is made of his head. Well, sometimes I feel like it's made of my legs. What I've seen Tito speak before, and he does a lot of running around. And this is a way that he explains running around a lot. It's like, it's really hard for me to kind of feel my entire body. His body is so messy that he behaves very unusually. Third example is stereotypical movements. So that might be anything from moving hands back and forth, rocking. And in one journal article, we see that a participant says, stereotypical movements aren't things I do for a reason. They happen by themselves when I don't pay attention to my body. So this really flies in the face of the assumption that we sometimes make that all behavior is communication. In this particular example, behavior is not communication. Somebody's engaging in a behavior that they're not even aware of. And this very much reminds me of Michael J. Fox when he first was diagnosed with Parkinson's. He would talk about how his body would start shaking and would start moving in really interesting ways. And he said, it was out of my control completely. And so again, this theory posits, to me, it's very interesting that if people across these different kinds of disability areas are experiencing similar things, potentially the things that we do for people that can easily express themselves and that can talk about these issues, those things can be then translated and brought into the lives of our youngest children who may not be able to express themselves. So last time that we were together, I talked about inappropriate laughter. That falls into this idea of movement difference, right? And a lot of you had really good comments about that. You were saying, okay, I have a loved one that laughs inappropriately, and this has happened to me at a funeral or something. Here's Donna Williams saying laughter is not, sometimes it's not what you think it is. This is a problem with the body kind of misfiring. Very similar to what this in the previous slide where Sandra says she can be crying on the inside but her eyes are dry, that I don't have access to emotions in the way, to expressing emotions in the way that other people do. So it can be very hard for other people to read my behaviors and to read my intentions and so on. So movement differences, the ways that people move atypically, and some of these problems, they are problematic for people, not only because they can give the impression of behavior that's intentionally bizarre, they can cause problems for people and their caregivers and their teachers, but they can also give the impression of low cognition, that somebody looks like they're not smart enough to engage in a different way when really they're experiencing a problem of the body. They can impact developmental experiences, so kids who have a hard time handling materials because of some of these struggles, if you can never, I know some of you have seen kids, I work with, again, a lot of kids with lots of needs, kids that can't even page through a book on their own in sort of a typical way. If you can't even page through a book on your own, page after page, and explore the, literature and favorite books and board books the way that other babies would, then your developmental experiences all the way through your life will be different. If you can't throw the ball back and forth with mom and dad or your siblings, the ways that people will play with you will start to change. And pretty soon, you might not have those same experiences of reciprocity anymore because you were unsuccessful, and I put that in air quotes, in early iterations of this. Not being able to smile and giggle and laugh in the ways that other people do, that can impact the way that people, they joke and laugh with you, we tickle our babies. So these can be very problematic for people, and they can cause other struggles in their lives. And then, as I said, they can really mask the real essence of the person. So I think you'll have, if you're confused about what I mean by movement problems, it'll become more clear, I think, as I start to talk to you about some of the remedies and what Donnellan and Leary and even David Hill have suggested might be helpful for kids. So some of these will be overlap of things that we have talked about or that we're going to talk about next time. But the reason I'm sharing them twice is I first want to at least couch them in this movement differences theory so that you might start to understand how kids act and react in slightly different ways. And next week, we'll talk about them just more generally as supports for the classroom and beyond. So I'm going to talk you through 4 different kinds of accommodations that will help movement differences. And one of the things that you're going to see in all of these examples is that for each and every one of them, all of the supports that I'm going to suggest to you, they're proactive, they're positive, they're sensitive, they're generous, and they're gentle. And so that is something that is, I think, worth paying attention to, is if some of these work, and I'll give you specific examples when we get there, but if you find a support that works for a child and it actually helps his body to feel more comfortable, and you stop a challenging behavior in its tracks, or you prevent one, you will maybe start to understand the behavior in a completely different way. And to me, that's the power of this model. So we'll talk about that as we go. But let me go through the very first set of supports, starting with these visual accommodations. So, we know that visuals are incredibly powerful. We're going to talk about them again next time in a little bit of detail. But when we use visuals, here's a couple of examples, like first then boards. This is, or like a picture schedule, and this, as you know, first then board is basically the first, it's kind of breaking down a picture schedule into its tiniest components. First, we're going to do this, and then you can have some time with an app. So these kinds of things help kids to feel less, I think, confused about what's happening next. It helps them to feel more grounded in expectations. And I also think it's a little objective, that instead of saying that the teacher needs you or wants you to do this, we can just say, well, the schedule says, or this is what needs to happen first, and then it can happen. So let's take a look at the visual and let's see what the visual says we should do. So I think it takes away some of that conflict between teacher and student or parent and child. Other kinds of visuals can help students actually do what I call it, see themselves strong. And when you have a body that doesn't work well for you, it can be really powerful to see yourself strong. What I mean by that is we want to provide products that help kids see themselves successful. This is a little gal who was really struggling, and I mean struggling to the point where screams going into physical education. We don't know if it was that it was a new environment. Excuse me, got to sneeze. Or at least a tickle there. Okay, maybe not. But lots of screams going in, that it was a big environment and it felt out of control to her. We had a lot of guesses, but it wasn't her favorite class. Her teacher decided to create a little, kind of like a social story book for her. And this is not her special ed teacher, her physical education teacher did this, which I think is pretty amazing. Made a little book. On the left hand of the book was a little story about what we are going to be doing this year. And so juggling is one of the things that we're going to do. And what was happening for this young lady was that she would come in, and one of the things that seemed to be an unknown was that every single time you come to gym, it was a different thing. Are we doing volleyball? Are we trying relay races today? Are we using equipment? Are we going outside? The novelty seems kind of overwhelming to her. So the teacher thought, well, if that's one of the things that's in play here, the least I can do is kind of cut down on that by giving her some images related to what's going to come up. And so there was a page on juggling. There was a page on using scooters. There was a page on just the exercises, physical fitness exercises. There was a page on doing relay races, which they did a lot. And so when they actually would repeat some of those games and exercises, she would be prepared because she had a page in her book related to it. And she loved this book. It was almost love at first sight. When a child, and this is what I mean by movement, by using a support, when you use a powerful support that responds to a challenge a student is having, a challenge that is about perception, a challenge that is about sensory discomfort, a challenge that is about the unknown, and a challenge that is about, again, in broader terms, the body, and you present a support that immediately changes the situation and the story, then all those assumptions, those negative assumptions we make, go out the window. So if you're assuming, she's trying to avoid, doing any work in physical education, or she's testing us, those kinds of negative assumptions. When you provide the child this little See Me Strong book and she immediately looks better, we know that she was experiencing, some pretty significant fear or struggle or physical discomfort. And so it helps us to see the child in a different way. And I think that's the power of some of these supports. This is a visual that you can use to help with anxieties and to help kids with transition problems. Remember, we said that sometimes switching is a problem for people. So here's a kid who asks a repetitive question. He has a problem with stopping the behavior, which is asking the question, when is spring break? When is spring break? When are we going to have spring break? Do you know when spring break is? And this is also especially a struggle at the end of the day when he has to transition out of the classroom because he's wondering, is this the last day before I come back to school, and am I going to be gone for a while? So to help him feel more relaxed and calm, we created this little at-a-glance schedule for him so he could actually tuck this away, and having a visual that was always accessible to him would help him to answer that question. Nobody had to verbally answer the question for him. He could always access it to feel more calm and centered and less, I think, confused and a little bit more aware of what's coming up, and therefore how much what I can expect is happening between now and then, a little bit more information. This is a visual that helps kids feel more in command when it comes to directions that may feel either overwhelming to a person, or maybe a ritual that is too open-ended to me. So this is a kid who has problems with his body in space a little bit. We put markers on the floor, on the classroom floor, so that he knew exactly where to line up. If we didn't have markers on the floor for lining up, he would kind of try to get to the front of the line each and every time. So you look at a kid like this and you think, oh, he always wants his own way and he's inflexible. Okay, but what if we put his name in line, and as soon as he has that marker, he goes and stands on his name in line? Then we have a different way of understanding the behavior. Maybe it's just too open-ended and too overwhelming. And so when we can see kids fall into place with some of these supports, then the behavior looks a little bit different as well. So maybe giving kids more parameters around some of these tasks and some of the requested behaviors. You can use little tiny portable visuals too, things like direction cards. You can use, some teachers wear more general commands like stop, or you can line up on a ring around their neck. But for a lot of commands, they may be more specific to the classroom itself. Like you might have a set of cards for writing up your lab notes, like this is the time, you can predict something now and write your summary now. The ideal situation is where students would actually use these on their own. They would use them and take command of them themselves. So you want to start by having the teacher present them and then teach students how to use the visuals as sort of a way to put things into place and make an overwhelming situation feel a little bit more organized and predictable. I want to share one more with you that I skipped over. And this is something that's really specific to behavior, and I'm not sure if I mentioned it at all last week, but one of the things I've done as a visual support specifically for behavior is when I see that somebody is really struggling, I often just grab a notebook and start writing. I have found that somebody who is starting to really lose it, somebody who is in particular feeling, if I'm hearing things that might relate to confusion about where I'm going, what I'm supposed to do, things are changing, this isn't right, this is different, the bus isn't here, I might start to narrate and support the child by just writing what's happening or giving as much information as I can, but I like to do that visually. So you just might grab a notebook, and even for a child who cannot easily communicate, I often just start writing, and if I don't know if the person's a reader, I just start whispering everything that I'm writing. And so I might write something like, you seem really confused about where we're going. I can see that you're very upset. I don't like that you're hitting yourself. I'm going to sit with you here, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we're doing. And as I'm talking and as I'm writing, I often find that kids move their attention from my face to the paper. And as I begin to detail what's going on and fill in information, I often see that shoulders get calm. I often see that kids look more physically organized. I see the breathing sometimes, hopefully return to normal. I was in an IEP meeting with a young lady, and she, I think, was getting upset over some of the things she was hearing. So I just started to write to her and whisper, very softly about what she was hearing, giving it a context. She got very relaxed. So sometimes providing information, but doing so visually, is incredibly comforting for kids. And I don't think, maybe some kids you can even do it by typing into the phone. I've typically used paper and pen. I think it's a little bit, my guess is that it's kind of nice that, just to see the pencil moving is a little hypnotic. I just have felt that intuitively. It seems very calming to kids. And for kids that can write back, it helps to kind of, just have that rhythm back and forth too. But by all means, if you have kids that are attracted to the screen, you can actually just grab an iPad and start typing as well. So those are all visuals that might get you a positive result for somebody who's struggling mightily. The other thing that you can do is, you saw maybe in that last slide, is you can have kids watch movement. So sometimes when I have somebody who really looks off to me, or somebody who is, I'm trying to bring back from the brink of something, I might suggest that they watch me engage in the behavior that I need from them. So if I need them to transition out of the room, I might say, I can do it first, or you can do it with me, and we can kind of do it coactively. Or I might just show the person, okay, I'm going to see if you can get up now. And so I was on a swing with a little boy, and he just seemed really stuck on the swing. So I sat down on the swing, and I just kind of showed him, I'm just getting up now. I'm going to hang onto the chains, and I would push myself up. It wasn't that I physically thought he was disabled and couldn't do it. It's that he was so distraught that I felt like he needed just to kind of be removed from all the other stuff and just focus on the physical movements to get his body sort of functioning again. So they sound sort of like tricks, and I think in some ways they are ways to override what's happening to somebody in distress. The second category is emotional accommodations. And, I'll say that I think we don't see this nearly enough in working with people with especially kids with more significant needs, but even kids with learning disabilities who people may view as kind of annoying, or, kids that may have ADHD, is sometimes, even when we don't feel like being kind and generous and loving, those are the most important times to be kind and generous and loving. And so all kids need the same kinds of things. They need expressions of confidence. Letting kids know, in particular, that they can complete some of the tasks, even that are physical tasks. Like if you're trying to get somebody to kind of go through a meditation with you because you want them to get centered and you feel like they're really off the rails, letting them know, like, I'm here with you and you can do this, and try it with me. Letting somebody know that you're trying to get them to count backwards as a way to kind of, maybe get back in the building because, they've had a meltdown on the playground, and you just want to sort of let them know that you're there for them. Humor in certain situations can be incredibly powerful. Has to be appropriate for the person. But, sometimes adding a little bit of humor into a situation, disrupting a moment that could kind of go in a different direction, can be helpful. Associations. Many of you probably use a strategy called power cards, and you see an example there on the right. A power card is basically an association. It's telling the person that is in distress that there's a model that they can hook into. So a power card essentially is an idea from a woman named Gagnon, Gagnon, and she's written a whole book on this idea of power cards. And Gagnon's idea is that you're going to write a little story about somebody who is having a problem. And instead of saying that it's this child, Charlie, you're going to say it's not this child, it's somebody else. It's Thomas the Tank Engine who's having a problem. It's the Avengers, they're having a problem. And you make an association for the person. And the idea is that a lot of people with disabilities, and quite frankly those without, nobody wants to be criticized. Nobody wants to be told you have to change your ways and this is what I need you to do. So you take a character, you take someone or something that the child really likes, and you give that person the same problem. So let's just say that, I know it's hard to perceive there, but that's a power card of Shania Twain. It doesn't look like her, but that was my best drawing. And I was drawing it on the fly. And this was created for a child who is struggling because she's hugging and kissing people at school, and she's a high schooler, and we don't want her to engage in that behavior anymore, and we can't talk her out of it. And so we want to talk about her favorite singer, Shania Twain. And Shania Twain is having the same problem. She's been hugging and kissing too many people when she's been on her latest tour. And so how we're going to deal with that is Shania's decided it's dangerous to do that. She's not going to do that anymore. What she's going to do from now on is she's going to shake people's hands. And so you first write a story about this. if you've got somebody that's throwing toys or something like that, you write about Thomas the Tank Engine is throwing toys, and he doesn't want to do that anymore because he knows that other trains will get upset with him. And you write about Thomas then sharing the toys. And then, according to Gagnon, you make this little power card that helps to cement the association. She suggests 3 quick steps, and so that the child doesn't always have to go back to the story, they can carry a little business card in their pocket with a 3-step reminder. That's essentially what a power card is. So you can go to Teachers Pay Teachers, and you can Google power cards, and you'll see all kinds of examples. In fact, Teachers Pay Teachers has some really cool I thought I put it up here, but if you go there, they have all kinds of, for typical, pragmatics, different kinds of classroom, typical classroom behaviors, nothing too specific, but there's, you can buy Disney Princess power cards, and you can buy Star Wars power cards and things like that. And of course, you can just make your own. So what's an association? I had a kid who would just go into rages if he didn't win a game of kickball. At recess, he'd be so upset. So we made him a power card of one of the Chicago Bears, his favorite team. And we talked about, how it's, really it's about sportsmanship, and it's about exercise and having fun playing the game. And even though you could still see he was distressed and losing, he did so much better after accessing his power card. And we even put it on a keychain for him so he could be reminded that emotional accommodation. It's not me, but it's, Brian Urlacher, that needs help with this. And he kind of repeat his steps and kind of go through that to kind of feel a little bit more organized. So associations in general can be really, really helpful for a lot of folks. For a lot of people, just being there, staying with individuals. I talked about this a little bit last week, but letting someone know that you are going to be with them through a difficult situation, that you will, stay by their side if needed. Sometimes even, again, dropping to a whisper. We talked about that with the calm protocol. But for some people, just being soothing and treating some of these challenges with empathy can actually help us to bring somebody back down, especially when we feel like they're on a ledge of sorts. And then shifting eye gaze. So one of the things that we know a lot of kids, especially on the spectrum, appreciate is gaze avoidance. That eye contact can be incredibly stressful for some people. It's not terribly useful in actually understanding what somebody's saying. And so if you want somebody to really listen and to hear your directions, your words, your recommendation, your any advice for following through and getting them, using self-calming techniques, all of those things will be helpful if you refrain from eye contact and shift your gaze. And again, if you have to communicate something, even switching to writing or even a simple gesture can be seen as an expression of understanding for lots of kids. Cognitive accommodations is another area that some of these are going to sound so unusual, I think, for some educators, because they're not the typical kind of thing that we might employ for certain kids, especially for kids who have not shown their competence in certain ways. And again, I find for kids that, especially when people tell me this kid is really low, and they tell me that this kid can't do it, I often will recommend cognitive accommodations, because I feel like part of the reason the person might be engaged in perseverative behaviors or interfering behaviors is because they aren't appropriately challenged. They are bored. They are drafting off of the behaviors of somebody that's near them because they're not stimulated enough. And I also find that we haven't taught them enough strategies, cognitive-based strategies, that will help them pull themselves out of challenges or get redirected in a moment. So cognitive accommodations are things that you might use in your own challenging moments. Things like calling up memories of a time. So we can tell kids, that there have been other times where they've been really successful, where they've been able to, complete a task that was really challenging, or that they have been able to share their toys successfully, or that they have, when they've been really upset with somebody, that they've been able to apologize and repair a relationship. And so that can be really helpful. And for some instances, when a kid has a really successful moment, I might even ask him if he wants to document in some way, capture an image on their iPhone so they can call up all their successes. And that can feel very empowering to somebody that feels out of control on a regular basis. Meditation. There are guided meditations all over. There's so many apps that are available. There are mindfulness. There are websites that you can hook into. Many of you are probably already using Gonoodle, which is a website that has all kinds of active learning supports for kids, right? And Gonoodle has all kinds of neat. I'll come to those in a second. Let me talk through Gonoodle first, and then we'll look at the books. But Gonoodle is a website that has all kinds of brain breaks and active learning supports. And they have a newer contribution to that are these meditations. And they have kind of little, soothing video that you can watch as a group or with an individual child. And so when you see somebody who's bubbling over, instead of redirecting them or telling them to, looking at their smiley and frowny chart, ask them if they would like to try breathing or trying a meditation with you or a group. And they're really good practices for all kids, and they're really actually powerful for adults too. So you want to look at the mindfulness resources on Gonoodle. Try them. They're really great for getting kids centered before any kind of an assessment. They're really nice to pass on to families because Gonoodle is free. Most of it's free. You can buy into other parts of it to get more material. But Gonoodle is just, a good first stopping point if you want to find some tools that will help kids. And again, it's a whole body, kind of approach to this. So it's not just working on the behavior, it's working on the person in the most respectful way possible. So consider that. Again, there's lots of apps. So if you work with older kids, you can definitely help with your, teach these to your older students, and they can go to the apps when they're in the workplace or when they're at home. And so it's a nice thing to then pass on to your families so that they know to cue their children to go and use the apps, or maybe they can use them potentially as a family, especially in times of distress, or go to that as a way to kind of recover from a very challenging moment. So think about those kinds of tools. Along the same lines, you can think about things like visualization. And so again, all this kind of stuff, this mindfulness that we often, maybe we associate that as something that you would, do with adults. We're seeing more and more that entire schools are adopting these tools. They're having meditation breaks. They're teaching visualization strategies to help kids, achieve more. They're helping kids to get focused and centered and to be aware of themselves. And there's even schools where they're using meditation strategies and mindfulness strategies as kind of and I put this in air quotes, but as part of like detention, or as part of the going to the principal's office. So and having really great results with that. So think about, how you might want to do this as a preventative technique, or even something that's a way to respond to challenges. And so I want to just pop ahead to these resources here, because these are really nice tools that you can bring into a classroom library. The one on top is something that I've used with older kids and adults. And so that's it was something that I tried with a young lady. She was an adult, and she was having all kinds of problems. She was a neighbor of mine, actually, and I moved away to Chicago, and her mom contacted me and said, all of a sudden she started a new high school, and she's really having a hard time at this new high school. In particular, she has a really long bus ride, having all these transition problems in our examples today. But the mom was super concerned, and they said that they were, saying that they didn't want her on the bus anymore. It was getting that bad. And so I came up with the idea of kind of communicating with her during her rides. And this is before the iPad, but she had a little tiny computer. And so I took this 5 good minutes, and they're little meditations. And I just recorded myself in a PowerPoint format talking to her And I did about 10 of them, and it was my voice. And so I don't know if it was my voice, like an old friend, or if it was the fact that nobody had ever, again, seeing a child with lots of needs, had ever thought to use mindfulness or meditation with somebody that barely had, she didn't have much reliable communication, but she began to indicate her enthusiasm for her meditations. She would get on the bus, she would flip it open, and she would cycle through all of these different meditations. And apparently the staff was just blown away. And I think the reason they were blown away was because they wouldn't have thought to use a cognitive support for somebody that was perceived as being, and I'll again put in air quotes, but being so low. So these are some of the strategies that are my favorites for kids like that, because I don't think we often give them the respect of these whole body approaches. And sometimes these are the kids that need them so much more than other kids. Not that other kids don't need them. So anyway, there's lots of exercises. This is sitting still like a frog is one of my favorites. There's a lot now that you can bring into classrooms or bring home. And again, they're kind of good for the whole family or the whole classroom. So that's what I like most about them. You can even use little mantra cards. This is another cognitive strategy. I got this off a website. You can actually, I think Yannick, I think has some materials you can purchase also. But these little cards, again, I would use these for any kid, but they're sort of mantras that you can use to have kids download either when they're having difficulty or, again, preventatively, to kind of make sure that they are full of messages that are positive about their ability, about ways that they can calm themselves, about, reminders about their potential, even reminders about places where they're strong. So she's suggesting these for any child, but again, I've used these kinds of mantras and messages for kids with all kinds of needs, including kids with a range of disabilities. So on the right side of the page here, those mantras, I have created all kinds of products with mantras. Things like, that is a little keychain. I've created, buttons or magnets for inside lockers. I've slipped them inside kids' binders. I've done everything but make t-shirts. I've created pencils with mantras on them. So many kids, I think we know as adults that we are helped by mantras. I'm sure if I asked you, what are your mantras? You may not think about them that way, but you might say to yourself, oh, this too shall pass, or I can do anything for 10 minutes, or just breathe. People, we use these, and we use them because they work. They are calming. They are powerful. So we want to teach them to kids too. And again, even if you have kids that you cannot necessarily see that these tools work because of their communication challenges, that doesn't mean we shouldn't employ them. So every kid should be respected enough that we would use cognitive accommodations in their lives. There's no harm in trying, that's for sure. The last one is intellectual stimulation. This seems like an odd addition here, I think, at times, but what Donnellan and Leary have found was that for some of their folks that they have worked with and that they have studied, that people will talk about being stimulated can be an incredibly powerful support for interfering behaviors. So we call repetitive behaviors, like I gave you the example of rocking back and forth. Some of those things that people engage in are actually, those repetitive behaviors are actually accommodation. So somebody who feels uncomfortable, or somebody that's trying to center themselves or stay in a certain space, may move atypically in some of those ways. So some of the things that we see with people, some of those repetitive behaviors are actually accommodations, and others are actually indicators of specific kinds of challenge or discomfort. So they're a little bit hard to read because different people experience the same kinds of interfering behaviors, or repetitive behaviors, I should say, and they will tell us that the cause or the purpose is different. Even in the same person, the same behavior can look very different across contexts and can mean different things. But one of the things that I see in a lot of people that I support is that they often look better when they're being sort of talked to and respected intellectually. So I met a guy named Tim years ago, and he was in a classroom and he was hitting his head, hitting his forehead with his hand and playing with some Play-Doh. He was about an 18-year-old man. And when I visited, the staff was telling me that he did this for long periods of time every day. And I was working on a literacy grant, and I wanted to go and talk to this kid. And they said, well, he won't want to talk to anybody when he has his Play-Doh, because that's his time to kind of stim. That was a way of understanding Tim. Well, I was interested in bringing a more literate kind of education to kids, especially kids with more challenges. And so I had entered this classroom as a way to target a couple of kids and sort of teach staff how to read to them and help to use augmentative communication to support writing and so on. So I actually brought Tim a book about autism. It's an autobiography called Beyond the Wall, and it's written by a guy named Stephen Shore. And if you like these autobiographies that I keep referencing, be sure to go to my Pinterest page, because I have a bunch of autobiographies that are my favorites on that Pinterest page. In any case, I started reading to this young man who was hitting himself in the head. And the staff kept saying, well, he's going to hurt you, he's going to hit you. And I went to sit next to him, and he just kind of vocalized a little bit while I was sitting there. He didn't hit me. And I just said, Tim, I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to read you part of this book, and it's actually about autism. And I began to read him a book that was written for adults, teens and adults. It certainly was not a child's book. And they perceived him to be, I said, if do you ever read him? And they said, well, we read him a couple of books, but they were more, picture books. And I began to read, and his body became incredibly still. And he got really close to me, and he was, looking like he wedged his head near my shoulder, and the staff was absolutely amazed. He sat for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 16 minutes, 17 minutes, and nobody could believe it. And at the end of the segment, I said, there's two ways we could think about this. He really likes being read to, or he's really interested in learning about this thing called autism, and he's caught on that that's really familiar. And it really helped that group to sort of, I think, assessed him in a different way, to think differently about him. Because if it was true that intellectual stimulation actually changed how he behaved, then maybe the issue wasn't that he needed more time out. I mean, I think everybody needs some time out, but that he actually needed more engagement, interest, novelty, and social connection in his day. And they set about giving him just that. They call repetitive behavior, some of them like headbanging and, vocalizing a lot and flipping your wrist. They call some of those behaviors in some context institutional behavior for a reason, that without motivation, stimulation, interest, social connection, and appropriate kinds of novelty, folks retreat into themselves, and there's not enough to hold on to and grab onto. So we'll talk about this in the third session, but I'm going to ask you to think about curriculum for kids with disabilities. Kids that have lots of behaviors, what are we asking them to do all day? And is it appropriately, again, socially connected, challenging, interesting, novel? Maybe we're making it too easy and it's not stimulating enough. So we'll come back to that one. This is, I'll share one more that's kind of gets at social connection here. And it's not quite mantras, but it's in the wheelhouse of that. So if we want kids to feel like they know the norms and routines, and we want them to behave appropriately, we may want to provide more connections to their peers, and that can be an incredible tool to get kids on the right track. So this is something that I call a social skill slam book, and I wrote about it in a book called From Text Maps to Memory Caps, and it's a lot of these little dollar store differentiation ideas. And this particular idea came about because I wanted this child who had a lot of, I wouldn't say it interfering behaviors, but he had a lot of odd behaviors, and people would react to those odd behaviors by kind of reminding him not to be odd, and I don't think it was terribly helpful. So I thought, well, he needs to hear from other kids. He needs to know what teenagers know, because he wasn't as connected as he could have been. So we made him a little social skills slam book. And a slam book, if you don't know that terminology, I grew up with slam books, but it's essentially the idea that we are giving kids, access to the inner secrets and the inner, you know, um, the kind of the behind the scenes of their peers. So when I was a kid, we made a slam book, and everybody in the class, we'd write answers to, mystifying things like, what's your favorite ice cream, or who do you have a crush on, or something. And I think it got the name slam book because kids write it, and then we slam it shut when the teacher comes around. But you can kind of see, okay, all the girls in your class, what's their favorite movie, and who's their favorite celebrity crush, and things like that. So it's kind of getting access to the whole and the social lives of the whole. So I got this idea about using that for social skills. So I put on this little paper booklet, I just had, the social problem on the left, and then on the right, I kind of had the child identify 3 peers, and then we just stuck them inside the book, and we asked those 3 peers to respond to the need of the child. How do you deal with perfectionism? How many times can you ask a girl out? What do you do at a school dance? And so the kids, and most of the pages had the same 3 kids that he knew really well, but sometimes for about asking a girl, he wanted to know from 3 boys. And so we had 3 boys on that page. And so again, this is not only an emotional accommodation, but it's cognitive. It's helping somebody learn those social rules, and sometimes reminding somebody that they're inappropriate is not enough. They don't have the information about how to be appropriate. And so it can be incredibly helpful. It also sort of folds into this idea of being visual, which can be really helpful for so many of our kids who need a little bit of everything in these categories. Okay, so finally we have verbal accommodations, and some of these are really interesting. This is one of my favorites. I'm just going to kick off with this little quote here from Donna Williams. Donna Williams actually just passed away, sadly. She has written several books. She wrote several books on autism. Her most probably popular is called Nobody Nowhere. So what's a verbal accommodation? Well, to me, this is just so fascinating. Donna found that she often had starting problems. Remember, that was one of the categories that I shared with you in movement disturbance, was that she literally couldn't initiate. Sometimes she couldn't initiate with movement. Sometimes she couldn't initiate with having a conversation. And she would find herself just in a conversation, especially if it became very emotional, and she would just shut down and she couldn't continue. And so these are some things that we see in people with, again, a whole host of problems, but certainly in people with autism. So she tricked herself. She used tricks, and she would tell herself a story. When she would tell herself a story, she found that she could be more fluent in her communication. I mean, to me, when I read this, I found it fascinating. Here are some of the tricks she would tell herself. She would say, what is being said is not emotionally important. It is just babbling. So even if she was pouring out her heart to a boyfriend, she would tell herself this trick that what I'm saying is not important. I'm actually not saying anything that is emotionally heightened. She would tell herself not to aim it at somebody that's a listener. I find this interesting because as a public speaker, I went through a bout of some speaking anxiety a couple of years ago, and I found the only thing that helped me as a trick for fluency was to look over the heads of my audience and speak to just the back of the room and not to people. And then her third is that it's not a speech, I'm just singing a song. And so she had this litany of things that she used to kind of to free herself up and be more free with her communication, so that she wouldn't look rude or she wouldn't look deliberately odd. So that's what we're talking about with verbal accommodations. What can we do to support people using speech, using language or words, or maybe the lack of. So teaching kids self-talk can be really important. Teaching kids self-talk can help them get themselves unstuck. We can teach kids certain things like learning even to count down. I've had kids who get incredibly frustrated, and some of their interfering behaviors just start with just not being able to. They're mad about the written work in front of them. So teaching them how to talk themselves through, again, back to the mantra, or teaching them to count to 10 before they start and just kind of get ready, giving themselves a pep talk. I had a student and he said, I don't know what you mean by this. I don't know what you mean by this. And I gave him short video clips of other 13-year-olds engaged in self-talk. Now, I picked 3 popular kids in his class. I gave them scripts. I asked them for help. They were more than willing to do it. He watched video of 3 kids engaging in self-talk, and he's able to calm himself right down. He was able to feel organized. And so this was a kid that, wasn't trying to be naughty. He wasn't trying to sort of make a scene. He just couldn't quite get everything together when he felt, especially in math, when he felt like he was tackling something more challenging than he was accustomed to. How about catchphrases? I've used catchphrases in lots of different ways. I had a kid who I could not get to transition through centers in kindergarten. And it was amazing because every other transition, he was just fine. But he would just flap his arms and almost jump up and down. I think there were too many of them. They were too quick. It was every 15 minutes or 12 minutes, whatever it was. And he just physically looked like he couldn't get there. It was really interesting. So we took a Big Mac switch, a single message communication device, and we thought, who is his favorite person? Who does he listen to? And the answer was the principal. And so we used this specific person's voice to get him to transition from one station to the next. And so we just had the principal record a message on to the next center. And all the kids that were at the center responded to the principal's voice, but in particular, this child really responded to that. I've audio taped a grandmother's voice helping with transitions or initiation of challenging times. I've had a father make a video for me where he talks a child through a soothing strategy at school, and many of these verbal accommodations have been powerful. Again, beyond a person's voice, I got a little sidetracked there, but catchphrases. So I got to send you to the workroom is a catchphrase from a show called the Project Runway, where they make clothes and they get judged on making clothes. And so when somebody has to leave, they tell them, I got to send you to the workroom. So for a child who is leaving, I had a kid who just loved music class and he never liked to leave. And so the teacher started using this catchphrase because it connected to a fascination. I've got to send you to the workroom. And he was able to transition using a catchphrase. And we hadn't seen him do that with ease at all before we use some of these catchphrases. So when he actually transitioned with ease, we were able to see he wasn't trying to be difficult. This isn't a kid who's trying to get his own way and he's trying to be manipulative. This is a kid who's really struggling with the transition itself. Sometimes shutting off speech, even as I said earlier, moving from speech to writing. Sometimes kids are overwhelmed with all the verbal. So moving away from it and simply gesturing about what you need the child to do can be powerful. I said chanting, counting, using rhythmic language can be really powerful. So many of us when I grew up going into a swimming pool, I would say 1 for the money, 2 for the show, 3 to get ready. Those kinds of rhymes that we use to help jump into a cold pool. It's not like we couldn't have jumped in without it, but because the transition was easier with it, we did use it. And you see kids using those kinds of rituals and rhymes today. I sometimes see people with autism rocking before they go through a doorway or going through something that doesn't look sensical to me, but I'm often of the impression that people make up their own physical accommodations to make the body work better. And sometimes, again, what you're seeing in really unusual behavior is actually somebody's accommodation to get through the day or perform in the way that we need them to. For example, I knew a guy who had a really hard time going into certain spaces. And so if he just touched the doorway on either side, like he could get into a space that might sometimes be a challenge for him. So for instance, he had he had homeroom in a science teacher's classroom, and they didn't have it that often, but there were pets in there. And I think there was some smells and noxious smells in there, and he didn't like it. So he would sometimes, like, just by touching the doorway, it was kind of that ritual would allow him to get into the space. So for some people, it may be that kind of ritual or routine that helps the body. In other cases, it might be some kind of a walking or a chanting, or let's count to 10 on the way for you, or 1 for the money, 2 for the show, that kind of stuff, that rhythmic language. I had one student I worked with, and we would climb all the stairs and we would count, and we would also use the visualization technique that I talked about earlier, and we would visualize that we were climbing the Mount Blueberry Hill or something like that, which is where Swiper lives, because he loved the Dora the Explorer cartoon. So we would count our way up to the Sniper's Hill, and he would visualize that he was climbing, and that often helped him to feel more fluent when he felt really pretty stuck. And you could see that he was able to use some of those strategies later when there was no one there to support him. So ideally what we want to do is provide these kinds of, even our meditations, even those visualization ideas. We want to engage in those supports across the board. We want to teach our mantras. We want to show kids how to create their own visuals or access their own visuals, because we're not always going to be there. And we want to make sure they know how to access these so they become life skills. Because most people that have some of these challenges, I mean, many of them are not going to grow out of them, and they're always going to, have some element of struggle because of their disability and their specific challenges. So I want to just end as usual with a couple of websites that you might want to access to learn more. One of my favorites that you can look to find out more about sensory needs. There's some products highlighted, and then all kinds of cool classroom stuff. And you can see one there, board games that can turn into handwriting games. The Inspired Treehouse. And it's just chock full of resources. It's updated regularly. It's a very pretty site. There's a lot of things that you could send on. So if you're a parent, things that you could send on to a teacher. If you're an OT, things you could send on to your colleagues. But really nice, supports and strategies that I think would work well across many different audiences. So check that one out. Another one that I like is Amy Laurent's. This is an absolute treasure trove. Amy's website has all kinds of video. In fact, I think, now I haven't done this yet, but I think I can actually take you to the website. So we'll try something here. Because what's really cool about it is I want to show you all of the really neat, oh, maybe I can't. I'm afraid I might do something that I might, well, I'm gonna go for it. As long as I don't get rid of our browser, we'll be okay, right? Because what's cool about Amy's, and the reason I want to show it to you, is she's got so many free resources, and all of them are video based. So it's not that they are video based in that they're video models for kids. They're video based in that you can watch the video and pass the instructional videos on to parents and teachers and therapists, who can then take her ideas, mimic them, and use them in classrooms. So like the little sensory support video that I showed you that I made, Amy makes these all the time. And so if you go to her website and you go to the supports and resources page, you're going to find all kinds of cool tools. So her support of the month, look at that, is free using fidgets in the classroom, something that's so topical. I didn't even know that was going to be her support. So it's really cool. You might have noticed when I was searching is you want to go to amy-laurent.com. If you go to amy-laurent.com, you end up on a matchmaking service. So unless you're looking for love, this is the one you want with the dash. And it is just a great one to bookmark, because a lot of it you can use in the home. She does a lot of stuff for the season, so like little Thanksgiving games and things that are coming up. She always talks you through the support. Like I said, there's always a video there. And so I don't want to get too complex here and too fancy by taking you through her videos, but please check this out. It's free, which is, right in the pocket for us. And she knows what she's talking about. She's really, very well versed in everything related to autism, but also, kids with other needs. So don't think that these things that you're employing with from Amy's site will just work for one population of kids. Really, so many of the things that she will recommend will work for tons of the students in your classroom and for children with all kinds of needs. I will say it's a little bit more weighted to young children, but there's plenty out there that you will want to probably employ. So give yourself a little bit of time to explore that one. And then today we talked a lot about mindfulness. And so if that was something that's new to you, or if that's something that you think you want to explore further, please go to mindfulschools.org. It has been really a resource that I have used so much in the last 2 years in particular when I started learning more about mindfulness. But it's going to give you resources. Now, this is not a website that's about disability. It's not about autism. It's not about learning disabilities. It's just about teaching in general. And there are just tons of resources on this website. You're going to find book links. You're going to find some of the relevant research. You're going to find suggestions for classroom activities. And so there's all kinds of little courses you can take. And it's really, to me, it's really nice because this is one of those rare things that you find in teaching that if you create supports for your students, it actually ends up being a support for you. So if you engage in you can see the teacher there engaged in a mindfulness techniques with their students. Well, you can't help but get a benefit if you're providing a mindfulness moment for your students, you're engaging in it, you too will remain calm. And if you remember our calm protocol from last week, that was one of the things that we talked about was, you need to also be centered. You need to be healthy. You need to be taken care of. And so this is one of those things where if you can add in these as part of a whole class approach or preventatively for our students, it's something that you could teach, when you have open house or something like that, you might have a little space for, hey, come on over and learn a mindfulness technique that you can use with your children at home. And so again, next time we meet next week, we're going to go over 10 different kinds of supports that you can bring into a classroom. But a lot of those will be in response to behavior, or they will be specific for certain kinds of kids. This particular piece is something that is really appropriate for everybody. And it's, you can certainly use it in a responsive way, but it's certainly something that will give you a lot of preventative bang for your buck. So check that one out, mindfulschools.org. Okay, so at this point, I just want to ask if there are any questions because we're really at the end of our time. And if anybody has something that they would like to throw out there, I'm definitely going to be, looking for any feedback between second session and third session. But if there's something specific or a resource that you want clarification on or anything that you've used that's been helpful, you can share that here in our last few minutes. And if there, we'll wait a minute there, and if there are no questions in particular, then we will give you some of our final comments here logistically, and I will just look forward to maybe you trying a couple of these things between now and then, and especially exploring some of these virtual resources, and we'll see you next week, or at least talk to you, right? One. Thank you so much. Yeah, somebody just said thanks. It's interesting. It is very interesting to me too. And thank you, Douglas. And that should cue me to recommend to you one of a resource that I didn't talk much about, and that is this movement differences material. A lot of it is summarized in a tiny little book by Martha Leary and Ann Donnellan. And it's if you just go to Amazon and you type in movement differences in autism, and I believe they use the language of mental retardation, which seems like because the resource is a little bit old now. It's been several years. But it is the only book for Donnellan and Leary on Amazon for sure. And it's just a little book that kind of explains the theory much more, I think, elegantly than I did today, and gives a little bit more insight to why some of these related supports may be powerful. So if this is something that's kind of in your wheelhouse, you might want to check out that that Donnellan and Leary, that 1995. It's been updated since, but you might want to check out that book on movement differences. So thanks so much, and we'll talk to you next week. Anything else we need to provide as a reminder?
That's great. Thanks, Paula. This is Carrie. So I put the link out there for the evaluation survey. We do appreciate that feedback. So join us again. Session 3 is same time next week on the 9th. Have a good evening.